Welcome to the series of reflections on the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, titled What Jesus Meant. Today, we address a question that most people raise in the context of emulating the example of Jesus Christ, who unwaveringly lived by the will of his Father in heaven. So people often ask, and I have been asked, a few questions, related questions. Questions like, is there something called the will of God? If there is this something called will of God, how do I know what the will of God is for me? Even if I know the will of God for me, how do I live by it? Finally, the most scary question of all, what if I mistake the will of someone or something else for the will of God? Will I not then live a lie all through my life? So these are questions that bother people, and therefore I thought it would be worth our while to address this question. And I will be addressing similar questions as we proceed. I'm not planning to bunch together all the questions that people ask one and address them one after the other. I will address them in the course of our journey to understand the truer meanings of Jesus Christ's teaching. So let's proceed with this question. Is there something called the will of God? How do I know it in relation to myself, so on and so forth? Now let me start by flagging the most central issue in dealing with this question, and that issue pertains to the issue of human freedom. But for human freedom, this question would not have arisen at all. Suppose we had no option but to obey the will of God, then no one would have wondered or raised this question. Is there something called the will of God? Now, for example, no one asks the question whether there is something called the will of the state. The state has its will, and the will of the state has to be obeyed. Citizens are not free to obey or not to obey the will of God. If you don't obey the will of God, you will end up in jail, right? So no one debates the question whether or not there is the will of the state, simply because it doesn't leave any margin for human freedom of choice. The will of God, on the other hand, combines human freedom with the possibility of knowing and obeying God's will. That is to say, it is up to us to believe that there is something called the will of God. Then it is up to us to find out that what that will of God is for me or for us individually. Then it's also up to us to endure in this difficult adventure of living by the will of God. So it's freedom all the way through, and that's the beauty of it, and that's also the problem lurking in it. The second point I want to raise here is, if you think that you are self-sufficient in leading a fruitful and meaningful life, please don't bother about God, much less bother about finding out and living by the will of God. If you are self-sufficient in leading a meaningful and fulfilling life, just forget about it. What I'm going to say from now onwards is not meant for you. It's meant for people like me who finds it impossible to live by my will alone, because I find myself completely inadequate to live the full potential of my life all by myself. I need help. And what I'm going to find out is what I discovered because I needed help, and I sought that help. And I sought also to understand the nature of that help. So let me make that very clear at the outset. Now, in order to think specifically and concretely, let's consider an example. The example of Abraham from the Old Testament, the book of Genesis. Now, Abraham belonged to a very insignificant tribe called the Hapirus. Actually, the Hapirus were a criminal tribe that lived on the fringes of the Mesopotamian society. Now, God calls Abraham out of that place and projects before him a possibility that he would go to the land he had never seen before, and that he would become the father of nations, and so on and so forth. So, at that point in time, Abraham, he was not Abraham at that time, Abraham has two possibilities. One is to stay on in the familiar circumstances of life and die in obscurity. We would never have talked about Abraham. The other is to venture into the unknown as called by God and to become the father of faith. Now, for a person like Abraham, who is ready for a great adventure in life, nothing is more important, nothing is clearer, nothing is less ambiguous than the will of God. In fact, if you were to ask Abraham, he would say that the will of God is the light by which I lived all my life, and I am so very glad that I could. So, you and I have the option to reject this path of faith, and of course, the consequences will follow. We are as free to reject this path of faith as we are free to reject education, employment, and the further opportunities of life. So, it's a matter of choice, and with each choice, we are actually delimiting ourselves, and that's entirely up to us. So, the consequence in excluding the will of God, which is meant to pull us out of our small little circle of the self, our own petty self, and to lead us into the wider possibilities of life, the consequence of rejecting the will for us is that we consign ourselves to mediocrity and meaninglessness, absolute insignificance in life, hand-to-mouth existence, which is unfortunately the plight in which most people are in this world. Now, as for the human delusion of self-sufficiency, let me refer to a very interesting myth from Greek mythology. That's the story of Phaeton. Phaeton was the son of Helios, Helios' son. So, Phaeton asks of his father, Helios, the sun god, for a favor, for a boon. And the sun god agrees. And what is the boon that, or gift, or favor that Phaeton asks of his father Helios? He says, please allow me to drive the chariot of the sun. All right? And the father is aware of the dangerous consequences, but since he is pledged to grant the request, he allows his son. And he gets into the chariot and drives, and the fiery horses drive the chariot here, there, everywhere. A picture of utter destructive, dangerous anarchy results. So, I thought I would make a reference to this because this myth holds within itself the insight that mere self-confidence is not enough. Mere good intentions are also not enough. We need something far above all these things. So, consider, now going back to the book of Genesis, consider the very important and interesting insight embedded in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and particularly now focused on Eve. The insight is this: if we don't live by the will of God, then we have to live by the will of Satan. I am speaking with reference to the story of Garden of Eden. See, Eve listened to Satan and imbibed his will. It was Satan's will that Eve, and through Eve, Adam, should eat of the forbidden fruit and fall away from God. So the choice seems to be between these two polar opposites. Either live by the will of God or live by the will of Satan. Now the satanic element has attained great elaboration since then. It appears to us in 1,000 forms. Again, that's not my central theme. Maybe in course of time I'll deal with it. So one thing is very clear. By virtue of being born, being raised and of growing up in a particular context, in this society, in this culture, in this country, in this particular period of time, we are all the products of this particular context. We are limited by this context. Now, do you want to rise above your context and attain to the fulfillment of the unique person that you are? Then you need something beyond, something more than what the human, social, political, cultural context can offer you. And that something beyond the resources of the world, all the sum total of all the resources in the world put together, is what we denote as God. All right? So we need to be pulled beyond the world, even to be of use to the world. Now therefore, in the light of what we have seen so far, there are only three possibilities for us. First is to be guided by self-will. I will live by my will alone. I don't want to listen to you, I don't want to consider anything else. I am sufficient unto myself. I will live by my will alone. But then each one of us, if we are a little humble, will realize that we are very seriously limited. For example, I can only speak for myself. I am woefully limited in my capacity to understand myself, capacity to what the future holds for me. And even if I pretend that I understand all of this, I am also woefully limited in my willpower to do the right thing that I know I should be doing. I have dealt with this theme in an earlier session. Therefore, there is no need to repeat it. So, living by my will alone is not an option, at least for me. The second possibility is, as far as I am concerned, I can live as guided by others. For example, when I was a student in the university, I came under peer pressure. The interesting thing is that other people know what you should be doing better than you know yourself. So, I was a student in St. Stephen's College at a time when drug culture was at its zenith. Fortunately, grinding poverty protected me from coming under this peer pressure, because I knew that the option available to me was not between having a high time along the path of psychedelic drugs and studying well. The option before me was between utter poverty and studying well. So I had to use every minute of my time to study, and I'm grateful to God that I was given that wisdom and fierce sense of purpose to use my time aright. So from what I've seen of life, I can tell you that going or living by the will of others is sheer slavery, because others are only interested in their matters and their advantages, and therefore you'll end up being used by others. And the word for that is slavery. A slave is one who is used by others for their benefit. All right? Okay. A third option. So first I said either you can live by your self-will, or you can live by the will of others, and an important manifestation of that in the present political context is public opinion. Why is so much money and so much effort invested into generating public opinion? Just to make people do your bidding. Who generates public opinion? The political, social, economic elite. That is then inflicted on the rest of the country, the vast majority of the people, and they are fooled into believing that public opinion is their opinion. Now surely this cannot be done for your good. It is done in order to take you hostage, in order to make you behave the way that's most advantageous to them. So through generating public opinion and inflicting that on the whole country, the society as a whole is turned into a bunch of slaves to subserve the interest of the ruling elite, the economic, social elite. So there is a third option, and that third option, of course, is being guided by something far higher than me, and that's what we mean by being guided by the will of God. Now, at this point, I want to recall a very, very interesting insight from a book by the great historian of the 20th century, Arnold Toynbee. The title of that book is A Historian's Understanding of Religion. And in that book he says, and he's saying this as a historian, not as a theologian or a preacher or a priest, nothing of the sort, only as an intellectual. So this insight must be acceptable to everyone, including the atheists. He says, history, after all, that's his domain. History is gripped by a force, a spirit of its own. History is gripped by a force of its own. And he says that's the diabolic spirit. But then he goes on to say something which really took me by surprise, because I did not expect a secular historian to say this. Then he says that beyond this power, the spirit that grips history, there is another spirit which operates above the level of history. And he says that is the spirit with a capital S. He doesn't call it the Holy Spirit, but then that would be Christian. He calls it the Spirit. So there are two forces, there are two levels, two domains of reality. And I thought that was fascinating, coming as it does from a secular historian. So now let me also enunciate a general principle, and the principle is this. And please, especially young people, please remember this. If you have no understanding, you will have to live by the will of others. There's no question about it. So, an individual who does not develop a wise understanding of himself, his predicament, his personality, his possibilities, will always live as enslaved by others. There is no question about it. So, either we go by the understanding that we can generate, or we go by the understanding of others. And as I said a short while ago, living by the understanding of others is nothing but slavery. So, it's our understanding and outlook, therefore, that determines if we should be free people or slaves. Now, consider Jesus' parable of the lost son in this light. What must have been the understanding of the young son? You see, the biblical narrative is very economical in its in the text. It doesn't give us all sorts of information, because that's left to the imagination of the reader, the responsible exercise of one's imagination. Now, what must have been the understanding of the young man that made him come to the conclusion that the best option for him was to leave his home and go to the far country? Surely he must have been influenced from beyond the house, his own home. Right? That's what we call peer pressure. So he must have come under peer pressure, and there is an indication in that, because when he sold his share and filled his pocket with money, his friends went with him, right? So the clue is already there. So what was the best option? He makes two choices, right? The first is to walk out on the house. The second is to come back home. Which was the better option? Now, when he was young and when his pocket was full, he thought the first was the best option. When the pocket was emptied and the friends left him and he found himself in the admirable company of pigs, the second option becomes the best for him. I will arise and go to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Now, which is the best option for him? No question, absolutely no ambiguity. Now, this is something that young people in particular must keep in mind, because our perceptions will change, circumstances will not stay the same, and therefore it makes good sense to have a long-term perspective, and actually wisdom is all about long-term perspectives. So, therefore, every young person, in fact every human being, and particularly young people, have to make sure that they are not used as tools by others. Because, my dear friends, if you allow yourself to be used as tools, be ready for the heartbreak of being discarded by them. Because every tool in this world is to be used and discarded. So the moment you consent to be used as a tool, you also give the free license to the people who use you to discard you. Do not later on sit and cry over it, because that particular eventuality is embedded in the initial choice that you made to allow yourself to be used by others. So the most sacred duty that we owe to ourselves is to resolutely refuse to be used by anyone in the world. Now, all of us in theory, all Christians, if they are Christians really, accept in theory that God is the creator. There is nothing in the world that's not created by God. Life is God's creation. There is no question about it. Now, if that is true, then it makes sense, it's sheer logic, that God understands life better than all of us. And if God understands life, and I am a small part, a small atom of that life, then surely it makes sense for me to believe that God understands my life better than I do myself. After all, it's God who designed me to be the unique person that I am. If you read Psalm 139, verses 13 and 14, you will read like this: "You shaped me in my mother's womb. I praise you and thank you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made." Who made me fearfully and wonderfully? It's God who did it. And therefore, God alone understands me, and God understands me definitely better than I do, and I have no problem. I have no problem in understanding and accepting this with gratitude and humility. And at any rate, if you are a young person, and this applies even to the old, but more so to the young, if you are a young person, you are still evolving. You really do not know who you are. You are still a sentence that the hand of destiny writes on the canvas of time. Therefore, being still a fragment of what you have to be and what you will be eventually, how do you presume that you understand yourself and therefore you can be in full charge of your life? It is very much like saying a piece of the jigsaw puzzle, saying, I am the pattern, I don't need the other pieces of the jigsaw, other pieces of the puzzle, and therefore I am self-sufficient. It's as sensible or as absurd as that. So, each one of us therefore is intended by God to have a very specific, unmatched and unmatchable role and responsibility and mission in this world. And only when we do justice to that is, only when we do justice to the divine purpose or God's purpose underlying our creation and our life in this world, do we become convincing evidence to others or reassurance to others that there is something called the will of God. Now, the cynicism about the will of God spreads in the world and spreads also in Christendom because Christians are not living accordingly. The true meaning of witness is this: each individual must so live as to make others feel and be convinced that there is God's purpose underlying the creation, underlying the life of every human being. That is called witnessing. Now see what a mockery Christians have made of it. Somebody stands up and says, because of this God man, that God woman, I got this favor, that favor, I got a lottery, I got a car and this. That's not witnessing. That's a very mockery of the idea of witness. To be a witness is to so live as to make everyone around feel convinced that there is God and the will of God is real, and there is nothing better a person can do for himself or herself than living by the will of God. That's called witness. And you must witness without uttering a word. You don't have to use your tongue. You have to live as a witness. So in the teachings of Jesus Christ, you have to be a witness. You don't have to be a mouth of witness. You have to be a witness to this totally different vision of life, different to the vision of the world. So, each one of us, therefore, must deem ourselves as witnesses to God. And also, looking at us, people must come to the conclusion on their own without having to say a word about it, that the best that they can do for themselves is to live by the will of God for which purpose they need to earnestly, diligently seek the will of God and find it for themselves. So, if someone is leading a meaningful and selfless life, rest assured there is God in his life, even if he pretends to be an atheist. There are some people who, because of their great embarrassment about what religions have become, Christians in particular, church in particular, they would say, no, I have nothing to do with God. But look at the beauty of their life, you will find that there is God in their life. There may not be God in their mouth, but there will be God in their life. And I've come across such individuals. They're very few and far between. As compared to them, the religious hypocrites in Christianity, who take the name of God in vain, put on the airs of religiosity and piety, and live in a state of utter dishonesty to themselves, dishonesty to God. They are an abomination. So, there are people who live the will of God without making a song and dance about it. Now, in all of this, of course, I don't have to say this, Jesus is our role model, and therefore, let's look at Jesus, look to Jesus and get the answers straight from him. Now, if you regard the life of Jesus, a few very significant truths come to light. First of all, Jesus is absolutely clear, and there isn't a shadow of doubt at any point in his life from start to finish that he came to do the will of God. Absolutely. And that's why in the model prayer that he has given us, we are taught to pray, thy will be done, thy kingdom come, thy will be done upon the earth as it is in heaven, right? The will of God. So there can be absolutely no doubt. And the strange thing is that Christians who pray, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, also ask the question, is there something called the will of God? How can I know that there is will of God for me, etc. But we don't connect these texts, and therefore we are unaware of the contradictions in which we live. So, living by the will of God was the defining element, the defining aspect of the personality of Jesus. Jesus never doubted it, not even once. Rather, it was the most concrete thing in his life. As he once said, I think it is in the 6th chapter of John's Gospel, he says, doing my Father's will is food and drink for me. I mean, nothing can be, no statement can be more concrete than this as regards the will of God. Jesus was absolutely convinced that it was worth his while to stake his total life on fulfilling the will of God. Just think of the cross of Calvary, no further argument is needed to establish this. And the final outcome of Jesus devoting himself totally to fulfilling the will of God for him and for humanity was the amazing fruitfulness of his life. The reason why humanity cannot forget Jesus. As long as there are human beings, as long as humanity remains human, Jesus Christ will not be forgotten. So, even on factual evidence, there is no other option that compares to living by the will of God. So, if God is not a figment of somebody's imagination, if God is real, God's will for us is real, then it makes good sense to understand it and to live by it. Now, this option may seem to be a little unpleasant and unwelcome to those who just want to cling on to their tiny little selves, in the process shutting themselves out of the joy of fulfillment. So that is something that I readily grant, and it's quite necessary to recognize this. Now, let us address a question which is relevant to this and which is often raised in this particular regard, namely, if I live by the will of God, I lead a selfless life, and I do the best that I can, or in the words of the 23rd Psalm, I am walking the path of righteousness for God's sake. why do I get into all this mess, this trouble? Ever since I took to this path, there is no end to my troubles. And isn't it proof enough that I'm not abiding by the will of God, that I get into all this unbearable, even incalculable difficulties, one after the other, one after the other? If I'm acting or living as per the will of God, why this mess? This question is raised by many. So when we embrace a goal that is at variance with the prevailing goal of any institution, any society, any system, any country, then you get into trouble. That's a universal principle. The safe option in the world is conformity. If you conform, you are reasonably safe from practical difficulties. That's why the temptation to conform is so strong with each one of us, because that would ensure that we avoid troubles and we ensure for ourselves a safe passage through this world. So, living at variance or living differently from the ideas, assumptions, goals and priorities of the world could provoke those around us, because human beings find it very difficult to deal with differences. This is a theme that I have addressed in another session, and I can only refer you to that particular video. Please look that up. So whenever we differ from others, different from the systems, institutions, including churches, we must expect stiff resistance and very angry reactions. That's again something that is demonstrated and illustrated beyond any doubt in the life of Jesus Christ. Jesus did not launch into an attack on the Judaic establishment. Jesus simply differed from the custodians of Judaism. Their idea of Judaism was very different from the true insights, the spiritual light of the Jewish faith. Jesus happened to disagree with them. He had to disagree with them because he came not to humor some religious worthies. He came to do the will of his Father in heaven. And therefore, he had to necessarily differ from the people who had distorted everything. But since their distortion came to be accepted as a norm, Jesus was seen as a rebel, as an enemy of the religion and the culture. As far as the Jews were concerned, their politics, their religion, their culture, their race, everything was the same, which aggravated the problem 100-fold, right? So he was seen as a comprehensive enemy to all that the Jews cherished. That's simply because they had come to believe that the distortions that had been imposed on them over a period of time was the norm. So any degree of difference will be dealt with very brutally, very sternly, and that's what the cross of Calvary points to. Now, if you examine the history of ideas, it's very interesting to do so. You'll find that whenever a new or original idea was introduced, it was opposed stiffly. No matter how profound that idea was, how beneficial that idea was, everything was opposed tooth and nail, till humanity or the society concerned or the nation concerned had to grudgingly accept it, because the idea was more powerful than the people who opposed them. That's why Victor Hugo said, no one can resist an idea for which the time has come. So, the resistance, therefore, that people put up with against original ideas and ideas that differ from the status quo can be understood, and the anxieties that the anxieties that a person experiences when he gets into trouble, when he takes to this path, the path of being unique, can be understood and misunderstood as follows. First of all, it can be misunderstood as, well, I get into trouble because I've taken the wrong path, and therefore now let me correct myself. Now this temptation is very real, and if we succumb to that temptation, then you'll end up completely frustrated and defeated in your life. That's the reason why Jesus says, I think it's the 24th verse, 24th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, "He who endures to the end will be saved." Oftentimes, we may start off with good convictions, clear convictions, good intentions. You're very clear that this is God's will for me. And as you proceed a little along this path, you begin to get into trouble, then you begin to develop uncertainties, you begin to debate within yourself, really, did I get it wrong? Maybe I have, therefore let me go back. And that's the end of it. And you will never again try this. And that's the sadness of it. Not only that this time you are defeated, but that never again will you try. That's a problem. It's tantamount to your spiritual death. That's the seriousness of this issue. The second option, the right way of looking at this is, I am on the right path, my goal is futuristic, and therefore I cannot expect my contemporaries who are stuck in the status quo to understand and appreciate what I am doing. Therefore, it's only natural that they react in this hostile and violent manner, and they attack me. It's a sign of their limitations. I need to endure, I need to put up with it as best I can. Maybe a time will come, and that in my lifetime, when everything will change, and the idea now resisted will be hailed as the great blessing on humanity. Now, therefore, ultimately what makes the difference is your character. Whether you read uncertainty into the scenario of facing difficulties, or you read further confirmation that you're on the right path, into the very same dynamics, depends on your character. That's why the old proverb goes, character is destiny. Character is destiny. Now, I'm in this context reminded of a statement by Albert Einstein. By the way, it's amazing. I recommend two of Albert Einstein's books to you. They're available on the net free of cost. You see, unlike the scientists of our times, scientists in olden days, great scientists like Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, etc., Galileo is another example, Giordano Bruno is another case. They were also philosophers. They were great men of great thought, men and women of great thought. It is fascinating to read their line of thinking, right? So, Albert Einstein said that your brilliance can take you to the top, but it is your character that keeps you there. Very, very interesting. Your brilliance can take you to the top, but it's your character that keeps you there. If your character is not well developed and it's not founded on good foundations, as Jesus says, like a mansion built on the rock, then you're sure to crash. Your achievement will be your defeat. Your present celebrity status will be the measure of your humiliation and the general contempt that will be heaped on you. So therefore, take care of your character. Unfortunately, education today completely ignores the very fundamental educational goal of character building. Neither in schools nor in colleges and universities any attempt is made to help young people become conscious of the need to form their character on sound principles. Even when value education is attempted, it's very interesting that in almost every school I know, and I know schools by their hundreds, value education is delegated to the most useless teacher. I'm sorry to use this concept. I don't want to think of any teacher as useless, but this is a perception of the head of the institution. One who is not good for anything else is called upon to do value education, and the consequences are predictable. So, if you want to be true to yourself, and being true to yourself certainly includes this very profound and challenging idea that God has a very special and unique intention for me. I am here because of that intention, and it's my duty to fulfill that intention. And therefore, I am required to be unlike others, not because I don't love them, not because I want to feel superior to them, But simply because this is God's will for me, and the will of God is benign for everyone. It seeks what is good for all others, and therefore my being true and faithful to the unique calling I have will eventuate into what is good for others as well. It will contribute to the general good. And even if therefore I am for the time being in this tiny narrow context despised, ostracized, rejected, etc., doesn't matter. God will use me as a very tiny source of blessing to others. And if not today, tomorrow, day after, it will be recognized. So this is the kind of faith that we need in our times. Because as all of us know that the spirit of intolerance is raging in the modern world. As a matter of fact, the more materialistic, consumerist a society becomes, the more intolerant it becomes of any difference and deviation. And therefore, a consumerist society actually undercuts its own long-term interests by embracing immediacy, that is immediate satisfaction, as the only and supreme goal. So, in such a society, in such an age, in such a culture, there is an even greater need to believe ardently and resolutely in our personal uniqueness, not just as an ornament, not just as something to flaunt to others, but as a very humble, sober recognition in gratitude to God that this is indeed so, and therefore I am under the obligation to fulfill the purpose underlying the kind of person that I am made to be. So I must also therefore believe in the uniqueness of everyone else and respect it, and therefore respect the fact that others will always be different to me. I never expect anyone to be a carbon copy of myself. Now, respecting this personal uniqueness can be understood by a beautiful image that Jesus has given. I mean, he gives it in a different context, but I'm sure this meaning is also included in that. In the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, verses 14, 15 and 16, Jesus says, "You are the light." But there is a problem. The problem is that this light is hidden by a bushel, right? Now, the light hidden under a bushel is precisely the uniqueness of your personality. Now, that bushel is a social, cultural conditioning that you have suffered. You know, by virtue of living in this world and growing up within a certain context, we are being gradually covered, heaped with all kinds of worldly baggages. If instead of growing up in Kerala, I had grown up in Africa, I would have talked differently, my lifestyle would have been different, the way I practiced my religion would have been far more spontaneous, etc. If I were born in Europe or in North America or in Iceland, I would have been different. The outer shell of my being is inflicted on me by the world. About that, I really have no choice. Where I have a choice is in relation to my inner life. And therefore, the spiritual focus is all on how we develop and celebrate our inner life. After all, whether or not I live by the will of God is decided within me and is a reality internal to me. The world may not see it, but something that I must believe firmly in it. So, the idea of being unique and therefore carrying within oneself an expectation that's godly, which needs to be fulfilled, is a truth that's, if at all, obvious only to myself. It cannot be obvious to anyone else, and therefore I cannot expect anyone else to respect that. No one else can see it, and therefore no one else must be expected to respect it. But I know it, and therefore I have no excuse for not valuing it, respecting it, and living accordingly. And therefore, the duty to be faithful to this unique person that I am puts me under the duty to struggle and realize the full scope of that uniqueness and to fulfill it to the best of the graces and gifts God gives to me. This involves a life of suffering, and that life of suffering is the proof that we are on the right track, and that life of suffering is also the guarantee that we will develop to the uttermost as far as our spiritual personality is concerned. And therefore, let me conclude this part of our discussion by saying, yes, there is something called the will of God, and living by the will of God is the best option for us. Indeed, there is no other way. Thank you.